When you're trying to choose the best calligraphy nib for any given project, there are a lot of factors to consider. In this calligraphy nib guide for beginners, we're going to go over all the important factors for choosing the right nib to do the job at hand, as well as our favorites and personal recommendations. So there's no right answer for which nib is the best or which is best for beginners. This really depends on a lot of things. First of all, it depends on your personal preference of how you want your script to look. Here you can see different examples of different levels of contrast. You can see this one has bold contrast. This one is a little bit more dainty and thin. And then it also depends on how heavy you write. So having a heavy versus a light touch influences which nibs feel easier to write with or more difficult to write with. And there are lots of factors, like I said, and the most important to start with are flexibility and sharpness. So flexibility and sharpness both influence how the script looks as well as how it feels when you're writing it. So in these examples here, the top row, the two words on the top, were both written with this nib, which is called a Nikko G Nib, and the second row, both of these words were written with the Hunt 101 nib. And then in the first column, I used light pressure, so I wasn't pressing extremely hard when I was writing this, and that's my natural tendency. I'm very light-handed. And then for these two, I was pressing really hard. So if you know that you are naturally heavy-handed or you naturally have a light touch, that's one thing that you can look at. So if you have a really heavy hand, you're going to be writing more with more bold contrast. Your thick strokes are going to be a lot thicker than if you use less pressure. You won't have as much thickness in your downstrokes. Now, the factor that affects the thin strokes in your writing is the sharpness of the nib. The Hunt 101 is very sharp at the top, so you're able to get very thin lines. And then it's also a lot more flexible. So you'll notice overall that the words written with the Hunt 101 are thicker than written with the Nikko G nib because this nib is more flexible. The more sharp and the more flexible a nib is, the harder it is to control. So that's why the Nikko G is usually recommended for beginners, is because it's slightly easier to control. If you have downloaded our free Copperplate practice sheet, which you can find in the description, this practice sheet, if you're wondering like how thick or how thin your thin lines and thick lines should be, this is actually based on the Nikko G nib, so you can see it's pretty similar to the top row, which again was written with the Nikko G, as far as the thickness of the downstrokes as well as the thin strokes. Now let's take a look at these two nibs in action so that you can see what it looks like when we write with them. So here is the Nikko G nib, and I'm going to make the same series of strokes with these two nibs. Make some thin strokes like the entrance stroke. This is the underturn from the fundamental strokes. This is a compound curve. So as I'm writing with the Nikko G nib, it glides across the paper pretty smoothly because, like I said before, it's not super sharp. But in order to get these thick lines, you do have to press down pretty hard. And if I want to get super thick lines, you have to press down super hard. So this nib can actually become this thick, but I wouldn't really recommend writing like that because your hand is just going to get tired from pressing down so hard to get a super thick line. Now, if you run out of ink like this, that's when you know it's time to redip. I always recommend finishing off your shape and then going back and filling it in rather than stopping right in the middle. Okay, now let's look at the Hunt 101. And this feels a lot different when you write with it. You might hear a little bit of scratching noise as I'm making upstrokes, and then as I'm making downstrokes, it just takes a lot less pressure to get the downstroke. So I'm not really pressing that hard right here, and I'm getting a stroke that is just as thick as when I was pressing down super hard over here. So if you like the thick contrast like this, and you want that to be part of your style, then I would actually recommend starting with the Hunt 101 nib so that you can get used to controlling it. Even though it's not usually recommended for beginners, if that's the style that you want and you like the bold contrast, then why not get started using the Hunt 101 so you can start getting used to the flexibility. I remember the very first time I tried using a Hunt 101, I just thought it was so hard to control because I had been practicing with the Nikko G, and it just felt like I could get a thick stroke with barely pressing down, and the thin strokes, if you're using paper that's not really smooth, then sometimes it's kind of scratchy because it is so much sharper. Some of the other differences between these two nibs, the Nikko G is a little bit longer than the Hunt 101, which doesn't really matter, but you will notice that if you put this nib in, that it might look like it's coming out the end more than this one. Also, I've noticed that the Hunt 101 tends to look like it's starting to get rusty sooner than the Nikko G does. And just because it looks rusty doesn't necessarily mean that it is. It could just be that the coating is coming off. For both nibs, I do recommend cleaning the ink off with a paper towel periodically as you're practicing, and definitely at the end of your practice session. The price of the two nibs are very similar to each other. Most nibs are around $1.50 to $2 in US dollars. So the price of choosing a nib isn't really that big of a factor because they're all kind of around the same price and they're not super expensive. They will last you, depending on how often you practice, several weeks, maybe even several months if you're not using it every day. I do recommend getting at least, if you choose one of these or if you want to try both of them, getting at least 2 or 3 so that you have a backup when you need to replace your nib. Something else you'll notice as you're writing, another difference, is that with the Nikko G Nib, you have to dip your pen less frequently into the ink because you're not putting as much ink on the page for each letter. With the Hunt 101, since it's more flexible, you are leaving more ink on the page, so you do have to dip it more frequently. I think I wrote almost this entire word without dipping it, but for this one, I think I dipped it almost every letter. A mistake to avoid is getting a nib that is either not flexible, like this one. So this one is not a pointed pen nib, so this doesn't write the same way that this one does. You might also see broad edge nibs. You want to make sure if you're doing pointed pen calligraphy to get something flexible. You also don't want to get a fountain pen nib because that's not the same thing. You also want to make sure that your nib will fit in your holder. So there are some smaller ones like this that are kind of like a circle on the end, and that won't fit in this type of holder because if you look at it from this angle, it's like a curve and it's not a full circle. So you just want to make sure that the nib that you're choosing, if it's not one of these that I'm recommending to you, that you get one that is flexible and that fits in your holder. I do want to show you 2 more popular nib options. This is the Gillott 303, and this is sometimes called the blue pumpkin nib, and there's actually 2 different kinds of the blue pumpkin. That's just its nickname because the nib itself has kind of a bluish color when you buy it, and that's just the nickname because it also kind of looks like a pumpkin shape. The actual name is called the Brause Steno, and then there's also a version that's a little bit cheaper than the Brause Steno called the Hero 40 or the Leonard 40, and that's what this one is. So the Gillott 303, again, the nib itself is really small, so it might not even come out the back of your flange. I noticed that writing with a smaller nib just feels different too than writing with a bigger nib. Now this one is kind of in between the 2 that we've already talked about. It does have a much sharper point than the Nikko G, so it does feel more scratchy when you're writing on the paper. It's also a little bit more flexible. I would say it's noticeably more flexible than the Nikko G. I don't feel like I have to press quite as hard to get a thicker line, but it's definitely not as flexible as the Hunt 101. So this is kind of an in-between, but I would say that the frustrating part, like you might have just noticed, my nib got caught on the paper right there when I was trying to make an upstroke. So you do have to have a light hand on the upstrokes, because if you're pressing too hard, then you're gonna get skips in your lines. But this is another good one to try if you're looking for something kind of in between as far as flexibility. So the blue pumpkin, otherwise known as the Brause Steno or the Hero 40 or the Leonard 40, is much less sharp. Like, tip is much more dull. And to me it feels very weird to write with because I don't use it very often. But you can see, okay, I think I might have had a little bit too much ink on my nib right there. But you can see that the thin strokes especially are super thick when you compare them to the width of these thin strokes. It's like almost double the amount of thickness. And it's also not super flexible. It's similar flexibility to maybe the Gillott 303. Definitely not as flexible as the Hunt 101. I'm struggling to use this because I don't use it very often, and different nibs act different ways with different inks. So the ink I'm using right now is Sumi ink, which is pretty thick. So I'm wondering if I maybe add a little bit of water to the ink or just experiment with a different consistency, then it might flow a little bit better. So if you notice that your ink is flowing just fine on one nib and not very well on another nib, then you could just try different combinations. There are so many factors in pointed pen calligraphy. But once you find a nib that you like the appearance of and you like how it feels when you write, then you can really start practicing with it and get used to all of those different things. So like I said before, your personal preference of style, of how you want your nib to look, the thinness and the thickness, is up to you. I've noticed that modern calligraphy that uses a pointed pen, I'm writing the word modern here, usually tends to use something a little bit less flexible with thicker lines. This nib, because it's not very sharp, is also a lot easier to write with without snagging on the page. So something like modern calligraphy, usually you'll see has thicker upstrokes in your letters and not quite as much contrast. And then super traditional calligraphy, or certain styles of traditional calligraphy, like the Spencerian style, has very thin upstrokes and lots of contrast. Also, a style like Spencerian does not have a thick stroke on every single letter, so you can see there are some spots where I added pressure and some spots where I didn't, but this is always done with a very thin, a very sharp nib that has the ability to make thin lines. This Hunt 101 that I'm using right now, I've been using to practice with for several weeks, so it has gotten a little bit more dull. If you get out a brand new Hunt 101, the thin lines are going to show up even thinner than this. If you're enjoying this video, learning about different types of nibs and seeing them compared with each other, why don't you give this video a like? We would so appreciate that. You can also make sure to check the description of this video so that you can download our free Copperplate practice worksheet, which also includes guidelines and traceable fundamental strokes. As you're practicing, I do recommend keeping a paper towel on hand. I like to also keep a spray bottle, and what I usually do is I spray the paper towel with some water and then gently wipe off the nib on both sides until you can get as much ink off as possible. And as far as storage, I usually just store my nib in the holder, You can take it out of the holder. I happen to have several holders, which is why I have all these different nibs in different holders. Just a word of caution, make sure that you don't have ink that is going all the way up to the point where your nib goes into the flange. Right here you can see I have some gold ink. I must have dipped this in too far into my ink, and it first of all stained the nib because I didn't clean it fast enough. And now my nib is really hard to get out. It's kind of stuck because the ink has dried inside the flange. So you don't want to let any ink dry inside the flange. If it helps, you can actually remove your nib, clean it completely, and then put it back in. For new nibs, I usually just keep them in the box that they came in. Buying a box of 10 nibs usually gives you a little bit of a discount per nib. So I like to keep, this is the Hunt 101 and this is the Nikko G. These are the two nibs that I usually have on hand, and I just like to keep them in the package so that they stay in one place. Also, for some nibs, it is kind of hard to tell what nib it is. I got a sampler pack. You can tell what each individual nib is by looking at the body of it. Usually it's printed here, engraved, and this one is a Hunt, and then the number I can see right here is 56. This is a Hunt 56, and these are all different in here. So when you're practicing copperplate or Spencerian or modern calligraphy using a pointed pen, know that there is a huge variety of nibs out there. There's way more than what I just showed you here. In fact, this sample pack I think came in with 25 different nibs, and it doesn't end there. So there's lots to choose from. I hope that this video was helpful to get you started. If you're still stuck and you have no idea which one to use, just start with the Nikko G because that is most common for beginners, but know that if you are someone who is light-handed, like I am, I struggled with the Nikko G at first because I felt like I just had to press so hard, so you might want to try something a little bit more flexible. It does take time to get used to, so don't give up right away. Just keep at it, keep experimenting, keep practicing, and you can watch some of our other videos for more tips. So tell us in the comments below, if you're a seasoned calligrapher, what is your favorite nib? And beginners, what are you practicing with today, or which one are you going to get after watching this video? We're happy that you decided to come learn calligraphy with us here today. And beyond YouTube, we also teach online courses that we will link in the description below, along with our Copperplate practice sheet freebie. We would love to have you as a student.